So in the text lecture this week, I try to compress what these authors, Burdick and the rest of them, are telling us in the textbook, which we just read a few pages of. And so let me see if I can kind of compress that a bit. Um, what they're what they're doing is they're telling a story about the humanities um, in terms of the basic project of managing information produced by literate culture, right? And what they believe is that um, digital technology offers what they call new affordances to this old project, right? And an affordance is just a fancy way of saying that one thing is made possible by another, right? So So digital technologies and computing make certain new things possible that are going to transform the old project, right? This is what we talked about this before. And so for this week, we're just going to talk about three aspects, three of these affordances or new possibilities for the humanities that are opened up by digital technology. So, in the process of making this argument, they tell the story that I summarize here, and it goes kind of like this. Um, you know, Collecting information has always been part of the project of the humanities. As you go back in time, closer and closer to the beginning of literate culture, there's less and less information, right? And so when there's not that much information, it's easier to just store everything, to collect everything. And it's tempting when information is scarce, texts, poems, stories, records, histories, all of it. When artifacts or pieces of written culture are scarce, there's this idea that it's all valuable, right? That everything should be saved. As time goes on, there's more and more of it. I mean, saying some gets lost, right? But new stuff is getting generated. And so as it piles up, collecting, as information and um, texts accumulate, collecting is not enough. You also need to arrange, or, in the language of uh, this text and of the humanities, to curate, right? Which is to kind of arrange in such a way that you throw emphasis upon certain things and you tell a certain story about it, right? So these two activities of collecting and curating, they argue, are fundamental to the project of the humanities. And as you look at the timeline, as information becomes more and more voluminous, as there's more and more of it, collecting gets to be something that has to go along with curating. You got to sort of figure out why you're keeping certain things and how you're arranging the things you're keeping and so on. Now, enter the digital revolution, right? So suddenly two things happen. A lot more information is being generated, and it to store that information and search it and retrieve it and organize it, all of that can now be done in new ways, right? And so there are two kinds of kind of specialists that are created by the project of the humanities. The scholars whose task is to know things about information, and the archivists, the librarians, the museum curators. These are the people who collect and curate, right? And so part of what Burdick and the rest of them are arguing is that the digital, in print culture, the scholars on the one hand and the kind of the collectors and curators on the other hand, we're sort of two separate groups of intellectual specialists. But that now, because of the nature of digital technologies, those two skill sets are merging again. So that's kind of something interesting to think about, particularly if you want to be one of these people. It suggests that there's a kind of set of transformations taking place in these fields, so that you would do different kinds of work and you would do that work differently. Um, okay, so as an example, so what they do is they say, um, there's this ever growing river of information that the humans are generating. If you so certainly the printing press, makes it possible for humans to generate more cultural material. Rising populations, rising levels of prosperity, and therefore leisure, make it possible to generate more text, et cetera. And then digital technologies make it possible to generate still more text. So there's ever more text, right? And they suggest that the digital humanities are in part a response to this river of information. And I think for my purposes, I mean, just to me as a reader, one of the most interesting things they do is compare Google Books, Google's ongoing project to digitize everything, every book in the world, with the Library of Alexandria, a kind of famously large library of the ancient world that was lost in a fire. And the estimates are that that book contained a few million scrolls, which would have translated, several scrolls would make up a book, right? So it would have translated into some tens of thousands of books, probably fewer than 100,000. And so at the time that our textbook was written, Google Books had reached 15 million volumes. So many orders of magnitude more. It's now over 40 million volumes, out of at least 130, perhaps 150 million titles. So what does this mean? I mean, it means that the average person with a computer or a smartphone has access to many, to thousands of times more information than the most privileged scholars and the most privileged and wealthy scholars of the ancient world, who would have been able to travel to Alexandria, gain access to the volumes, spend time in there, all of that, right? That at our fingertips, we have access to all of this information. Some of it's behind paywalls, but of course, those paywalls are much more manageable than the costs of, sailing to Alexandria and living there, and et cetera. So, we find ourselves in this vast and ever enlarging ocean of information. And what that means is that we have an ever greater need for curation. I mean, what is curation? It's in their definition, to curate is to filter, organize, craft, and ultimately care for a story composed out of the infinite array of potential tales, relics, and voices. Or in other words, let's just say to filter, organize, and craft and tell stories about the information. And the really, filtering is a big deal, right? If you think that you have access to 30 million books, 30 million pieces of transmitted human knowledge and experience and culture, obviously you're not going to ever in your entire life be able to read or even glance at more than a fraction of those. How will you choose, right? How will that information get organized? I mean, what will be the principle for filtering the massive amount of human knowledge and culture such that you can digest some of it so that it can enrich your mind and life, right? So that's, I think, one of the stronger arguments for the digital humanities is that if we're going to hope to confront this massive amount of knowledge and culture, we're going to have to organize it. We're going to have to curate it. And digital tools are the strongest tools for doing so. I'm not myself I don't mean to evangelize for the digital humanities. I have kind of, I guess, still an open mind about it. But so I'm just sort of trying to transmit their arguments. So two of the projects that I linked to and asked you to look at this week are examples of digital curation that our authors would probably consider enhanced. So they describe something they call enhanced digital curation. So it's not just that someone says, "Hey, here's a bunch of stuff," that's worth your attention, but that they put that stuff together in a format that takes advantage of digital technologies. So, for instance, Unladylike 2020 consists of it's a project that was put together on the occasion of the 100-year anniversary of women's suffrage in the United States, right? So just over 100 years ago, women got the right to vote, and it was finally decided that maybe the women were, you know, human beings and rational beings who deserved to be able to participate in the political process just about one long human lifetime ago, right? And so on the, I mean, this is kind of an astonishing fact, really, if you think about it, that it took that long. So this Digital Humanities Project um, is a celebration of that accomplishment. And what it does is it considers the lives of 26 American women who, these guys put it, excelled in science, medicine, politics, business, journalism, sports, aviation, and the arts. And these are people who, you know, uh, are held up as exemplary American women who enlarged the kind of menu of what you could do and be as a woman. And so, you know, there are short films about them, there's text about them, there are timelines, there's art. It's a multimedia kind of interactive thing. And so it's enhanced in the sense that if you compare it to a book about those women with a short biography, a chapter on each woman, a biography of her life, and perhaps things that she said or did or wrote, or, you know, et cetera, that would exist in sort of a print-only format. And the format of what you're looking at here is enhanced in comparison with that. I think it's quite interesting. It's a very interesting project. You know, and just to sort of pause on the idea of curation, right? To filter, organize, craft, and care for a story composed out of the infinite array of potential tales and voices. So you can see that here, like, it's just 26 women, right? And on those, so they've 26 women have been filtered out of all of the, you know, millions of women that could have been talked about in American history, going back to the time of the granting women the right to vote. So, so these women have been filtered out, they've been selected, and then stories are being told about them. And obviously, you know, the idea of caring about the stories, that's it, you know, the word curate comes from a religious idea of the people who care for the souls of the faithful or the souls of the dead in particular. So care is an important part of the idea of curating. You don't curate a bunch of like stuff that's you don't care about. You know, that's the stuff you discard. You're like, no, this doesn't make it in. This is not interesting. So what makes it in is the stuff you care about, right? And so caring about these stories, wanting to preserve them, wanting to transmit them to the present and to the future is kind of the organizing principle here. Um, Project Vox is similar. You know, what Project Vox does is, you know, if you go over and look at about, um, is that it presents you with the voices of philosophers who are not often um, read or thought about in the kind of normal study of philosophy. And you know, if you look at the description here, highlight philosophical works from marginalized individuals traditionally excluded from the philosophical canon. A canon is a curated collection of authoritative texts thought to be central to a tradition, right? Those not included in the European male-centric canon, which generally excludes people of color. Although these marginalized voices were often popular in their time, through historiographical and institutional efforts, their voices were obscured from philosophical studies. So what they're saying there is there's been a certain kind of curation going on that has led a certain kind of filtering and caring about some aspects of the human cultural past at the expense of others. And so some texts have not been read and others have been read, and they've been put in things like an introduction to Western philosophy textbook, or something like that, and other voices have been left out. And so, Vox means voice, right? Project Vox means, it's like Project Voice. So, so what they're doing here is they're trying to recover those voices and bring them together in one place. This website has 3 goals: provide students at all levels with the materials they need to begin exploring the rich philosophical ideas of individuals excluded from the canon, provide teachers with materials they need to teach that stuff, and third and finally, to help transform our current conception of the canon. So this is a big ambition. When you're trying to transform a canon, I mean, canons are built up slowly over time, and what they represent is a consensus among scholars and experts and informed people about what ought to be read and thought about from the past. So it's a big deal what the canon is, right? And in something like the philosophical canon, if you think about, philosophy is the record of the most sort of extended and serious and systematic efforts to think about what we are, what we know, and what we ought to do, right? So philosophy is the record of some of the most serious human speculation. So the canon about philosophy is a very important thing, because if we systematically exclude certain voices from the philosophical canon, what it means is we have a reduced menu for human speculation, right? So this is a very ambitious digital humanities project that I think is a perfect example of enhanced curation, and it's enhanced in the sense that it is not just, it's not like they just said, okay, let's have a book of marginalized philosophers that we think are important. Instead, they've got this kind of very complicated thing. They've got texts, they've got from the philosophers, they've got translations, many of them, like Sor Juana, for instance, is writing in Spanish. They've got translations, they've got lists of print editions, they've got timelines, they've got histories, they've got image galleries, they've got teaching materials, right? So for people like me who might want to incorporate Sor Juana into a course. So so there's more than you could do in a print edition. So it's enhanced in that sense, and I think it's already clear how it counts as curating. So they talk about, augmented editions in reference to something that you will be almost certainly familiar to you, which is a critical edition. So if you've taken a literature class where you've read a kind of literary classic that has, essays in the back and footnotes, and, like, for example, an edition of Shakespeare, a critical edition of Shakespeare, then you've seen this, right? So what a critical edition is an authoritative edition of a text that's surrounded by a framework produced by scholars and editors. And, why do we need critical editions? Well, the author what the author produces is not the same thing as what you read. So between the author, let's say of a play or a book or a poem or whatever, between what the author produces and what you read, there are these invisible people that are at a minimum editors. And so, the textual history of any particular work can be more or less complicated. I mean, it can happen that an author sits down, writes a perfect text that does not need to be edited in any way, never revises it. And in that instance, and then there's like, it never gets lost. No part of it is ever destroyed or altered. And so then in that instance, what the readers get is going to be very close to what the author produced. But for instance, roughly half of Shakespeare's plays exist in more than one edition that he is thought to have written. All right. So if you're going to sit down and read, King Lear, or, and Antony and Cleopatra or whatever, which edition are you going to read? Now, if you think about all the contexts in which people read Shakespeare, they don't generally read 2 or 3 editions at a time, right? They read like one text. And so how do you get from the multiple variant texts that Shakespeare produced to the one that you read? Well, you get there through editors and scholars, and they do a whole bunch of work to decide what to put in front of you. As you get deeper and deeper into the nerdy weeds of scholarship, you're more and more likely to go and read variants, the different editions. But most people did not. I'd say, certainly like 90% of readers just read whatever text is put in front of them of Shakespeare, right? So that thing is likely to be a critical edition. So it's likely to have had editors who are going to they're going to go back and get those variants, and they're going to decide, we're going to take these lines from this version and these lines for this version, and we're going to kind of glue them together, and that's going to be the play. And then there are going to be scholars who are going to be like, all right, what do these weird words mean from Shakespeare's time? Let's put those off on the side, the right-hand margin, in little, italics so they don't have to look up all these words, right? And let's have footnotes that explain things that are too big to put off on the right. Things off on the right are called glosses, brief definitions of difficult language. And then there's footnotes, right? So in other words, there's like a small army of scholars and editors that produce a critical edition, meaning an edition aided by critics and criticism, that you read. And so what they're saying is there's a lot of stuff that vanishes from the reader's point of view when you are reading a critical edition. You see the finished product of these invisible editors and scholars, and there's a lot of complexity that's dropped out of view. Well, in a digital context, we can bring that technology back in. That's one virtue of the augmented edition. So, for instance, there's something called the Norton critical, the Norton Shakespeare, right? The general editor is one of the great Shakespeare scholars of our time. And you can buy this thing. It's a big, beefy, thick red book that's, $60 or whatever. And it's got all the plays, and it's got a bunch of stuff in it. And if you buy it, I mean, I'm not urging you to buy it. I'm just saying, if you buy it, you also get uh, the ebook. And the ebook is I think a perfect example of what they're talking about when they talk about augmented editions. So let's just look at a couple of things you can do. So for instance, in the ebook, here's the table of contents. These are all the plays, right? And there's an interesting section at the end called comparative scenes and poems. So if I click on that, it opens this up, and it says this: about half the plays in the Shakespeare canon, the authoritative list of Shakespeare's texts, exist in more than one early authoritative form, usually an earlier quarto, and then the 1623 folio printing. Over the centuries, editors have tended to merge or conflate these texts into one version, deploying their knowledge of the practicalities of turning manuscript into print, and often enough, simply their preferences to decide what to include and what to omit. So, in a famous example of this is King Lear. So that's quite interesting, right? I mean, what that means is that what you have known as Shakespeare is actually not Shakespeare as such, so much as Shakespeare as filtered through the practices of these various editors, right? And so if we scroll down, I don't want to read that whole thing, but if we scroll down to the bottom of this, it's going to give us a what it then does is it gives you alongside each other a whole bunch of important examples of this. So one from Othello, Act 4, Scene 3, with the quarto and the folio, right next to each other, right? If I had to make it a little bigger in order to see it. But here they are, and you can kind of read across and see that they're basically the same until this important speech by Desdemona, who of course is the key, one of the most important characters, that Othello's wife, who he murders out of jealousy because he's confused and foolish. And we've got things like this, little glosses that we can click on. But the most interesting thing is over here in the quarto edition, which is, the smaller book, Desdemona's speech is relatively short. And here, her speech goes on further. Here she talks about a song that her mother's maid used to sing about being in love with a crazy person. Uh, she had a song of Willow, an old thing it was, but it expressed her fortune, and she died singing it. That song's night will not go from my mind. I mean, of course, this is a moment of great foreshadowing where Desdemona's impending death is kind of hanging over everything. And then she sort of is interrupted. There's a knock on the door. So that's what happens in the quarto edition. In the folio edition, she mentions the song, and instead of being interrupted by a knock on the door, she says, "I have much to do, but to go hang my head all at one side and sing it like poor Barbary." So here Shakespeare has her go on to say, not just to mention the song, but to say, even though she has much to do, but she's going to go and sing this sad song about loving someone who turned out to be crazy and who forsook her, which is just happening to Desdemona herself. And then there's a whole ongoing dialogue, and then she's singing. She actually sings it. She sings Willow. So none of this is in the quarto. So this is like quite a big difference, right? But quite interesting. So if you're interested in this play and you're thinking like, how does Desdemona feel about the fact that the man she loves has started to accuse her of unfaithfulness, and that she's innocent of, and is enraged and suspicious? Um, this is a very important moment, right? And it's a moment that you get to in an augmented digital edition. Now, you might say, well, when I look at this, I don't see any reason why I couldn't have this in a print edition. In fact, this looks like a page, and it's true. You can do it in print. It's just that it becomes more manageable to do something like this on a digital format because it doesn't take up as much room. If you're going to go ahead and print all the variants, and I mean, imagine, I don't know if you've ever taken a course on Shakespeare where you have to buy the whole book. Like a book that would stop a bullet. It's a hugely thick book as it is, even without all the variants. So if you're going to add the variants, it's going to get really big indeed, right? So that's one kind of thing that you can do in an augmented edition. I mean, here's another one that this one has, which is that it has spoken word performances of certain lines that are important in the play. So, so let's say I'm reading Antony and Cleopatra, and I'm interested in this famous scene in Act 5, where Cleopatra is talking. And I'm sort of reading it, and I'm like looking up these words, and I'm trying to understand it. And I think, oh, look, they've got a spoken word performance of it. So I just,
Iris, what thinkst thou? Thou, an Egyptian puppet, shall be shown in Rome as well as I.
sometimes it's helpful to hear how an actor who understands the character, who has gone through that enormous imaginative leap to try to project the character's identity into their own body and mind and voice, how that person pronounces the lines, right? So this obviously you can't do in a book. It's quite a long thing. You see how it's changed color a little bit there. I mean, it's as long as it takes
Mechanic slaves with greasy aprons.
that little black thing to go all the way around, right? So you can do spoken word performances. They also have facsimile images from the folio, which would show us that this is actually the folio edition in which the play was printed. And so we can look at that, we can read it in its original format and so on. So I mean, this would be an obvious example of what they're talking about when they talk about making a digital version of an authoritative text. They're usually, we think of critical editions as codex books, and they had to face the limits of the book format, page limits, choosing between how many variants to to give you, there certainly wasn't going to be any video or voice or links to performances of plays. And the whole thing is just limited by size. And also, you know, it's also limited by the fact that once the ink's dried, the book is done, right? And so if there's some huge new stride in scholarship, then you got to kind of like release a new edition of the book. But if you've already bought the book for $60 and it's on your shelf, you may not say, well, I'll go spend another $60 just so I can catch up with that. So that's where this next thing, the fluid textuality comes in, right? So obviously, um, the the Norton Shakespeare that I bought 3 or 4 years ago hasn't changed since I bought it, right? I mean, I've written in it, but that's it. But the online ebook, in fact, when I opened it up to talk about it here today, I had to download another pack of software because I haven't looked at it for a while, which means that it's changed, right? It's a fluid text. They define fluid textuality this way. Fluid textuality refers to the mutability of texts in variants and versions, whether these are produced through authorial changes, editing, transcription, translation, or print production. In other words, it's not stuck as ink on a page. And because of that, it can keep changing. And so that's one kind of fluid textuality, right? Another kind is, or another feature of fluid textuality is that there are a number of technologies that facilitate and even encourage multiple authors, all right? You've probably had this thing happen where somebody makes you do a group project and it's on Google Docs. And if you are working on it at the same time that somebody else is working on it, you have this weird experience where there's like a little different colored cursor and somebody else is adding language and so are you, right? But I mean, this is a vivid image of the way that the Google Docs interface creates a platform that encourages multiple authorship. There's nothing to, we don't have to like mail a manuscript back and forth to each other, right? It's like if your partner that you're working on a project with lives in another state or across an ocean somewhere, you can work on it simultaneously, or or you can work on it very easily. Like you put in your edits tonight, I'll look at it tomorrow, right? Or put in your edits in the next 15 minutes, and then I'll look at it then, right? Or put in your edits right now, and I'll watch as you do. And if I don't like them, I'll change them back, right? All these possibilities of authorship. Wikipedia articles and wikis in general, which support the production of a kind of print document that can change readily as new information is added and can support multiple authorship. So these are among the affordances or new possibilities for humanist curation and collection of cultural artifacts that they are excited about. The 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon text that we looked at last week is also like this, right? Because you'll remember I pointed out that there are those spheres that represent people, and then there are lines between them that represent, they either knew each other. There's two kinds of lines. There's like a bold line which says a human being has entered documentary proof that these two people represented by these two spheres knew each other and or had contact with each other in some way. And then there's like the gray line, which means there's a statistical likelihood that they knew each other, but no one has proved it. But the fact that I or anyone with evidence can come along and turn a gray line into a black line, or add a line where there wasn't one before, means that the huge array that is a map of who knew whom in the Elizabethan age among these artists, scientists, scholars, and politicians and explorers and important people, that's an example of multiple authorship and of a fluid text, right? The other example that I gave you to think about for this week, that we haven't talked about yet, is an example of an augmented edition. and it's of Hieronymus Bosch's famous Garden of Earthly Delights. And, if you open it, right, you immediately, well, first of all, I mean, let's do what would be the normal thing, right, which is to look at the static image of the painting. And in fact, I mean, what you have to do to look at this is it's actually the painting exists in a kind of cabinet, which, I mean, you may not even really discover unless you use the curated thing. But this is the cabinet, right? And then you have to imagine each of these things is a door, right? And these things kind of open outward in order to display this. These being the interiors of these panels, right? So that one opens this way, that one opens that way. And when they do, the interior is revealed, which is a continuous image here, right? This is a static image. There's no talking about it. I can, if I want, reduce it and read the Wikipedia article for which it's an illustration. But like looking at this and perhaps, perhaps trying to magnify it to look at some of these details, that's the sort of normal experience, right? But if I go over here and I start the tour, then, I'm going to have like, so now I immediately realize, I see, this is how those things are linked.
In the late Middle Ages, a master painter lived in the south of the Netherlands.
And I'm immediately getting a story.
In European history.
Context, right? Music. And if you sort of navigate your way through here, of course, which as I ask you to do, what happens is this, this voice, which is an informed voice of expertise, is going to take you to various details of the painting and give you a kind of almost an art history experience of the text, right? So this is a particularly obvious multimedia example of a curated edition that allows art to arrive for us in a way that's kind of like very fresh. I mean, in order to have this experience, you'd have to take a museum tour where this thing was available, or take a class on art history that covered Hieronymus Bosch, with a skillful professor who played soothing music in the background, or knew how to play the flute, right? So I suppose that will do it. I mean, that's a fairly thorough set of illustrations of what they mean by fluid textuality, text that change and not locked up in ink, and that and that are open to ongoing editing, alteration, addition, and multiple authorship. Additions that take advantage of digital media, multimedia, hyperlinks, and etc. And curated collections that also take advantage of multimedia technology. So those are just three simple instances of the affordances that Burdick et al. Think the digital humanities offer to the ongoing project to manage the mountain of art, knowledge, information, and culture that humans are producing.